For those of you who don't know me, my name is Evan Buey and I'm an International Initiatives Officer here at Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, specifically working on the export readiness and market intelligence file. I ask that everyone please keep your mics muted and turn off your video. We'll be taking questions at the end, but feel free to type them into the chat box as we go along. Before we move into our feature presentation though, I just want to give a quick snapshot of my team's programs and services and how we support Alberta agriculture companies. So I'm part of the International Market Development team, and we specialize in supporting Alberta agriculture, food and beverage companies export to international markets. We help to facilitate export workshops and training sessions such as today's, and we generate market intelligence for companies. We find you a wealth of information on your products in relation to trends, price competitiveness, competitors, and so on. We monitor market access issues and also help companies navigate free trade agreements. Our team is present at major agricultural trade shows around the world. We built a strong Alberta presence by procuring a pavilion for our clients, oftentimes partnering with other Canadian provinces to leverage the Canada brand. We coordinate additional programming around these trade shows, which may include things like B2B meetings, market overviews, and store tours. Alberta as a province has 12 international offices abroad. We also work closely with the federal government through the Trade Commissioner Service to tap into their expertise, networks, and buyer connections to help companies enter into those markets. So that is us in a glimpse, but if you're looking for more information, please feel free to reach out to me. I would now like to introduce our presenter, Christian Siviere with Solimpex. So following a 30-year career in international logistics in Europe and Canada, Christian started a Montreal-based import-export consultancy in 2010 called Solimpex, which is active in 2 areas: consulting and coaching to help SMEs grow internationally, and training on the logistics, customs, and regulatory aspects of international trade, importing, exporting, free trade agreements, supply chain management, and related issues. Christian also lectures for CIFFA, the Canadian International Freight Forwarders Association, in Toronto, and FIATA, the World Federation of Freight Forwarders in Zurich. He also gives seminars and webinars for various trade organizations and provides personalized training for importers and exporters. With that, I'll pass it over to you, Christian.
Thank you very much, Evan. And thank you for the opportunity to present to your colleagues and your companies. I'm very happy to be with you here today, this afternoon, to talk about the impact on logistics of the pandemic that we're all experiencing. So we have an hour and a half slot. My presentation should last about an hour, maybe a bit less, maybe a little bit more. And so we'll have ample time for questions at the end. So please feel free as to enter them in the chat as you go along, and we will take them at the end of the presentation. And so if everyone is ready, then I will begin. So thank you again, Evan, and your team for the invitation to speak to you, to your group here. So I don't need to introduce myself because Evan has done it very well, actually. So thank you so much for that. And we can then skip that slide. So before we get into the meat of the presentation of the topic, a couple of points I'd like to point out to our companies who are on the webinar today, particularly for new exporters. I think it's good to take a little step back here and talk about a few fundamental things that are important and that the pandemic has sort of helped us realize. So we all know we are in a pandemic. The pandemic was officially declared on March 11 by the World Health Organization. So what impact did that have, aside from the big upheaval, of course, that everyone has gone through, the lockdowns, et cetera, But so one thing that happened, that took place for international traders, for importers, exporters, is that many companies invoked the force majeure legal provision to say, basically, I can't fulfill that contract. I'm out of my obligations, and that's it. So it's an important point to keep in mind when we do business internationally, especially when we start exporting. Have a close look at our contracts, at the contracts that we're going to be using, at our contractual clauses. So force majeure is one of them, and it's designed to help us get out of our obligations in case of unforeseen situations. So the idea, of course, is that we have strong force majeure clauses in our contracts that protect us as much as possible. And with our suppliers, of course, ideally, we'd like to have them as narrow as possible. So, so that's something to keep in mind. Contracts are very important when we export, when we do business internationally. There's different models available. I show one here on screen, the ICC model sales contract. Any one of you would be interested, I'll be happy to send it to you for reference. And so, last thing about force majeure, because it was declared on March 11, you cannot invoke it for contracts that have been signed after March 11, because after March 11, the pandemic was a known factor, a known element. So it only worked for companies, for contracts that had been agreed upon before March 11, when the pandemic was not known. Because the essence of force majeure is that it applies only to unexpected events, obviously. The other little thing that's interesting to keep in mind is business interruption insurance. I mean, of course, it's easy to say these things after the fact, but I think it's still worthwhile to mention it. Businesses that had business interruption insurance today are obviously much better off than businesses who didn't have such insurance. So, I mean, I know there's a cost to that, but it's just a little reminder of the things the sorts of things we could put on our checklist when we start doing business internationally, is how to best be protected for unforeseen events, for unforeseen situations. So the second element I want to draw your attention to is Incoterms. Now, Incoterms are international terms of reference that are used by importers and exporters that define the obligations and the sharing of the costs, of the shipping costs between the parties. So basically, who does what, who arranges what as far as delivering merchandise, as far as shipping the goods, and who pays for what between seller and buyer. So that is fundamental, and that is something that we should be very familiar with when we want to export, when we want to do international business, because they are the international terms of reference that were used all over the world. And they will protect us if we use the right ones, or they could put us at risk if we don't use the right ones, or if we don't know our obligations, or if we don't know our risks. So the element I want to draw your attention to is that Incoterms don't just define the division of risks and don't just define the division of costs, but also the risks. So what does that mean, the sharing of risks? That means that if something happens during the transaction while the goods are being shipped, whether it's caused by a pandemic or whatever it might be caused by, and here as an example, I'm using this situation in India, where India closed all its ports all of a sudden at the beginning of the pandemic back in April, I guess that was. And so imagine if you had been shipping, if you had sent a container load of peas or beans or other grains, or pulses or whatever, to a customer in India, and then all of a sudden the Indian ports are closed by a government order. So what happens to your shipment? Well, it gets delivered by the carrier elsewhere, in a port in a different country. So what does that have to do with the Incoterm? Well, the Incoterm is what's going to say whose problem it is, whose responsibility it is to pick it up elsewhere and to assume the costs of that. So just to draw your attention to that, take the time to be well informed about the Incoterms and how they work and how which ones are the best suited for your needs based on your specific situation. So I show them here just for reference, for information. These are the intermodal Incoterms. And then, sorry, no, these are the Incoterms that are where the risks are on the buyer's shoulder. And these are the Incoterms where the risks are on the seller's shoulders. So something happens to the India containers that can't get to India because the ports are closed. If you sold under one of these Incoterms, it's your problem. If you sold under the other Incoterms, it's potentially your customer's problem. So just a little thing, a little reminder that the pandemic brought our attention to how important these terms of references are. And now I'd like to zoom in a little bit on the latest trade figures we received from StatsCan just a week or two ago on our June trade imports and exports. And so it was very pleasing to see. I mean, we all know that all businesses have been affected since March. And we all know that our exports have gone down, our imports have gone down because many of our industries and our activities have been brought to a halt, with the exception of food, medical, and essential services. So it's interesting and encouraging to see that in June we started to see a real pickup, a real increase, a rebound in our international trade. So overall, our exports were up 17% over May, and our imports were up 21%. It's also interesting to see how different it is between US and other countries. So as far as our US trade is concerned, it picked up in June. Our exports went up by almost 22%, our imports by 28%. We're still way below 2019. I mean, you can see it on the graph, actually. But there's still encouraging figures that will continue in July. And that will help us catch up a little bit. So the impact on our U.S. trade, why is it more important than on overseas trade with other countries? Well, it's because whenever something happens in the U.S., of course, or like the pandemic, for example, we feel the effect immediately because all of us live within a few hours from the U.S. border, and or most of us, I would say. And so whenever there's a big issue that trade stops and industries are on lockdown, then we felt the effect immediately. And then when trade picks up, we feel the effect immediately. Whereas with other countries, whether it's Europe or Asia or Latin America, then of course the effect happens later. So it's a slower process. So these are the figures from June. And as I said, I would say they are very encouraging, and I was very pleased to see these numbers coming up when the stats came out. Why is our trade with the US important? Well, I don't have to tell you that the US is our main trading partner. You probably all know that. In percentage, it's about 3/4. Last year, it was a little bit less than 75%. And with the rest of the world, it's about 1/4 of our export trade. On our import trade, it's a little different. And so this highlights, of course, the importance of being able to maintain our position there and improve our position and grow our business in the US. It also highlights the importance of how diversification would be interesting for us, because if we are able to diversify our exports, going to Pacific countries, for example, with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or with Europe, with the CETA free trade agreement with the European Union, that is going to help us diversify our exports and lessen our dependence on the US market. So who is our, out of these 25%, the rest of the world, I just wanted to share these with you for your information. Who are our main customers aside from the US? We saw that the US is our main customer. Well, actually, our second largest customer, individual customer, is China. And then it's UK, and then Japan, then Mexico comes in only in 5th position. The percentage is slightly different because there are different statistics. The first chart I showed you comes from Statistics Canada, from customs figures, whereas this chart here comes from the UN database, so they're a little different. But so that's sorry about that. But the other thing I wanted to highlight on these exports is that individually, China is our second largest export market. But if we take the European Union as an entity, and if we add our export figures, what we export, what we sell in Germany, Italy, and Spain, and France, and Netherlands, and we get to double the amount of our exports to China. So the EU actually, if we take it as an entity, is our second largest export market, a little bit over 8% compared to below 4% for China. And then, just for information, I wanted to share these with you as I was researching them. I think they're kind of interesting. Who is our main supplier? So the US, you won't be surprised to see that the US is our main supplier. Most of our imports come from the US, or the biggest portion of them, slightly over 50%. It used to be bigger than this, but of course, China's share has been growing over the years. And so again, China comes number 2. But again, if we take the European Union as an entity, then in fact, the EU is our second supplier, selling to us almost double of what China sells to us. So sorry, not double, but almost the same as what China sells to us. So it's an interesting perspective I think, to keep in mind when we look at our international trade figures, international trade stats, and the trends and where we should go. So let's look first at we're going to look at the impact of logistics on international trade, and mainly on our exports and for our exporters since the pandemic. So we'll look first at air freight. We'll spend a bit of time on that. This is where the consequences have been the most acute, shall we say. And then we'll look at ocean freight, and we'll look at trucks, we'll look at rail, we'll look at the various modes of transportation, and then we'll have a few more global considerations at the end. So if you're ready for takeoff, then we'll talk about air freight first. And so what has happened with air transportation, with air freight, air cargo, is that, of course, there was an immediate incredible impact on the availability of flights. As you know, as of mid-March, many countries either closed their airspace or prohibited travel and prohibited entry of foreigners. And so we've had this abrupt upheaval for the air transportation field that had a big impact on tourism, but that it also had a big impact on trade, because all of a sudden it was more difficult to ship goods by air. And we do ship goods by air on a regular basis. So what were the consequences on the airline industry is that, well, some airlines started to declare bankruptcy. So the first one actually was a British one, which is not very well known here, Flybe, but I kept it because it happens to be the largest European regional airline. And they were one of the first ones to go under. Virgin Australia, Avianca, and we know that our airlines have been suffering. We know US airlines have had huge losses and applied for huge government bailouts, government assistance. So the airline industry came to an abrupt halt all of a sudden, and that had a huge impact on our ability to send goods by air, to ship products by air. And so why was it so difficult, and why was the impact so severe on air transportation of goods? Is because under normal circumstances, you see the types of flights that carry goods across the globe actually are passenger flights. About 50% of air cargo transported on a worldwide basis is actually transported on passenger flights. in the belly of these planes, together with our baggage. And then about half of cargo, the other half, is transported on cargo flights that cater only to cargo. So these are specialized airlines. There's not that many of them. So the airlines that we know, the WestJets or the Air Canadas or the Lufthansas or the Cathay Pacific, about half of the cargo worldwide is carried on by these kinds of airlines on passenger flights. And so all of a sudden, when we had no passenger flights anymore, then whatever air cargo needed to be shipped had to be shipped on the other 50% capacity on the cargo flights. And of course, they couldn't carry everything, so there was a big shortage of space and of aircrafts, and which drove the prices up tremendously. And so this is why it's not a very well known fact, but cargo is carried. Half of cargo worldwide is carried on passenger flights. So all of a sudden, we had no passenger flights anymore. And so therefore, we couldn't carry the cargo that we used to carry. So even though, of course, because many industries were in lockdown and the pandemic created a big reduction in trade, but we still needed to ship a lot of personal protection equipment. If you remember, particularly at the beginning of the pandemic, all governments around the world were scrambling to find aircrafts, to find space to ship personal protection equipment by air. So the other types of aircrafts that are carrying cargo are these cargo aircrafts these cargo airlines. Cargolux is one of them. There's a few of them, and they're not that well known for the general public because they don't cater to passengers at all. And sometimes they even go to secondary airports and not to the main airport. So these guys, the Cargolux of this world, or the Atlas Air of this world, all of a sudden had to carry everything because there was no passenger flights anymore, or hardly any passenger flights. I think passenger flights in March, the amount of flights that were available on a global basis was about 5% of what it usually is, more or less. I mean, depending on the regions, etc. So these cargo airlines, these airlines that cater only to goods, to merchandise, they are sometimes hard to find or not well known. There's one tool that's pretty neat, is the one that's put together by IATA, the International Air Transport Association. They have on their website an air cargo operations status COVID-19 that gives you all the details of which airlines are operating and which airlines have issues with flight scheduling or aircraft availability, etc., etc. So it's a nice tool to look into. So what has happened as the peak of the pandemic in March, April, and I guess until May, is that every government around the world was scrambling to find capacity to move goods by air. So what ended up happening is that in some instances, we carried personal protection equipment on passenger flights with boxes installed and secured to the seats of aircraft. So many airlines did that. Of course, that was a very costly way of doing things, but that was in an emergency situation, it was the best way to do it and to be able to ship goods. I chose this picture simply because, I mean, many airlines did that. I chose this one simply because this aircraft actually was made in Canada. This is an Airbus A220 and made in Canada and operated by Air Latvia. So it was transporting personal protection equipment from China to Latvia back in March. And so what do our traditional passenger airlines, what have they done? And here I wanted to share with you these pictures from Air Canada, which has been one of the early adopters of this option of removing seats from passenger aircrafts in order to be able to move cargo. So to my knowledge, WestJet hasn't done it, but I know Air Canada has done it, and other airlines around the world have done it. So that enabled to these airlines to be able to cater to needs, to urgent needs of governments and others, particularly for personal protection equipment and medical things, and etc., because there was no passenger flights available. So you might ask me, how do we secure cargo? How do we ship cargo on these planes without the seats instead of passengers? And actually, the way we do it is we equip them with nets. And so you see at the on the floor of the plane, there's little rails in which the seats are usually bolted. And so once you remove the seats, then these rails are still there. And so you secure the cargo with these nets, and then you tie them to the rails at the bottom. So this is what it looks like. This is what the finished product looks like once the pallets, the boxes are secured on the floor of the aircraft. So this has its limits because you can't carry that much weight. You can't ship big parcels because the passenger aircraft doors are much smaller than cargo aircraft doors. But however, that helped many countries ship and get personal protection equipment in the early stages of the pandemic. And then, of course, afterwards, after the initial kind of a rush, then many of these personal protection equipment are being shipped by ocean freight at a much lesser cost. And so this Air Canada was one of the early adopters of that philosophy. They went through the trouble and expense of removing seats on some of their Airbus A330 and on some of their Boeing 787 and 777. They also did it on some of the regional aircrafts, the Q400. And so it's been paying off for them because they've had quite an increase in cargo revenue. You see this article, which just came out a few days ago, refers to an increase in cargo revenue of 52%. So that's nice for them. But on the other hand, of course, we have to admit that cargo normally is a very small share of a revenue of an airline. Cargo revenue only accounts for about 3, 4, 5% of an airlines like Air Canada. The major airlines get most of their revenue from passengers and not from cargo. So it was very nice to see these developments, and it helped. I think it helped us. It helped Canada be able to bring in these personal protection equipment across the country, mainly from Asia, thanks to these transformation of passenger flights into temporary cargo planes, loading cargo on the in the cabin, removing seats before that, of course. And so, because without this, the cargo flights that I showed you earlier would not have been able to carry everything. There's just not enough capacity for that. And so, to highlight the kind of situation that has been happening in air transportation, is I chose this because it just came out. I'd like the picture, but also the article just came out a few days ago, the results of Cathay Pacific, which was one of the most successful airlines in the world, based in Hong Kong. They had a huge loss of revenue because of the crisis, because there's no passengers or hardly any passenger flights. And it's interesting to see that for them also, they had an increase of revenue from cargo, which is quite specific and quite unique, and it's only because of this situation that we just described. So overall, the airline industry has suffered a lot, and most airlines, all airlines, are having hard times, and we hope that most of them can survive and can continue to operate and serve us, because otherwise, if so many go under, then we'll have less choices, less competition afterwards when things get back to normal. I also chose to illustrate Cathay Pacific in the little sign of solidarity with Hong Kong. So, to summarize the outlook for air cargo, what has been happening with air cargo is that because of the pandemic, it has been hard to find space. It has been hard to ship goods by air all over the globe, and there has been a reduction of business. But because of the need for personal protection equipment to be shipped by air, and demand was still strong. And so as a result, rates have gone through the roof. If you were shipping goods from Shanghai to Toronto or to Vancouver back in January, February, and paying $2 a kilo, in March, April, you had to pay $15 a kilo to get your goods on planes and on whatever little few planes were available. So huge increase in rates, sometimes up to tenfold the standard rate. Luckily, because as we said a moment ago, personal protection equipment started to travel more after the initial few weeks and few months of emergency. Personal protection equipment is being shipped by ocean freight, which is much cheaper, but takes much longer, of course. And so there's been a slowdown in this rush for to ship personal protection equipment. So that has brought rates down. So rates have started to come down from this peak of March, April, and a bit in May as well, and are back down to, not quite back down to normal levels. They are still, in some cases, about double the price we used to pay in January, February, but at least they are not 10 times the price. And so we hope that they continue to go down, go back to normal levels, but it's hard to see, it's hard to say what's going to happen, because on the other hand, if business picks up and the demand for air cargo flights picks up, and airlines are not able to get back on their feet fast enough, there might be a shortage of space, and then rates might stay high or might go up again. It's just hard to tell. And there's also the constant growth of e-commerce makes increases demand for cargo aircraft. So it looks like it's going to be stabilized, but and rates are coming down to more reasonable levels. But it's hard to tell if that's going to be a smooth sailing or smooth journey, shall we say, or if there's going to be some disruptions in the next few weeks and months to come. So that's as far as air transportation is concerned. So let us have a look at ocean cargo. What was the impact of the pandemic on our ability to transport goods by boat to and from Canada and Asia and Latin America, Europe, whatnot. We know we have a lot, of course, the majority of our goods, the goods that we export, move by ocean because it's much cheaper than by air. Air only ships urgent supplies or high value goods. So what has been happening in the ocean freight side? So it's been kind of interesting. What's been happening for ocean freight is that the effect of the pandemic has been much slower than on air freight, and the ocean freight business has been relatively stable. Demand has gone down quite a bit, but it has gone down slowly. And I'll share with you in a moment the stats from our ports to give us an idea of how business has been going on the ocean freight side, as far at least as Canada is concerned. But before that, let's look at the general trend. So the general trend, a fall in demand, yes, trade has been almost stopped, but not stopped, but has slowed down quite a bit, but not as fast as for air transportation, because of course the cycle time for ocean movements is of several months between the time an order is placed and an order is received, and it's a much longer cycle time. So what has been happening is that carriers have also worked on reducing services in order to avoid that prices would fall through the floor. So normally what should have happened is that prices should have gone down tremendously because there was less cargo to transport. But so what carriers did to avoid that, they started to idle some ships, and they also sometimes, to cut cost, also took longer routes to go to destination. I mean, this is a kind of a fun example. I know it doesn't really affect us here in Canada, but it's kind of amusing to think that some carriers, some shipping lines, when they go between Asia and Europe, of course they go through the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean, and then up to Europe. But some carriers, to save costs, they decided to bypass Suez, and they go all the way down to around South Africa. So a much longer journey, but you save the channel, the canal costs, you know, and a container ship going through the Suez Canal, it costs about almost $1 million in fees. So some carriers have used these innovative kinds of solutions to save costs and you know, thereby staying in business, but that has meant increased transit time. Volumes, yes, indeed, ocean volumes have gone down, and they're expected to pick up now, depending on how things turn out. And so what's happened is that the ocean carriers actually have worked together to adjust their offerings to the market demand in order to keep rates stable. And so they have adopted this policy of having blanked sailings. So they call, if you hear this terminology used in the transportation industry, what carriers do is the carriers who have a weekly service, for example, they say, okay, next week we won't have a ship. We'll leave the ship at anchor. We'll just skip a week. So they call that practice a blank sailing. So instead of saying we have no sailing, they say we have a blank sailing, you know, which is a kind of an amusing term. And so by doing that, carriers kind of adjusted their capacity to the market going down, to the lower demand for cargo, and that has maintained rates at a stable level. So it's kind of an interesting situation in ocean freight. And so to explain how this works or why this is so, I wanted to show you this picture of a Taiwanese vessel that's at the port of Halifax. Yang Ming Line is a Taiwanese line, and it enables us to salute Taiwan at the same time. So they operate this service between Asia and North America that comes to the port of Halifax, among others. And on these ships, on these Taiwanese ships, you see containers from Hapag-Lloyd, which is a German company. You see containers from K-Line, which is a Japanese company. You see containers from ACL, which is Italian. And so what happens in the ocean freight industry is that carriers work together to share the space of a vessel. So they have what they call joint services. And by doing that, they adjust their offering to what the market, what the demand is in the market. So it's a unique situation in ocean freight that is possible because the regulations for ocean freight are relatively loose. They're not the same as for air transportation. You could call it anti-competitive practice, but it is possible to do that. And so that's what ocean carriers do. So the ocean freight market has been relatively stable. Prices have not come down. They should have come down normally, but they have not come down. Carriers have maintained service. And by working together, actually, by limiting the space offered to shippers, not only they maintain the rates, but they've been able to keep the rates going up a little bit now that business is picking up. So it's kind of a very interesting situation. And so what's happening today is, as our economies are starting to come out of the lockdown, and particularly in Europe and in Asia, so business is picking up a bit. So there's more demand for ships, and carriers continue to have these blank sailings situations. They continue to limit the offerings, and they work together. They sort of collude together, actually. And today it is possible to do that in the ocean transportation industry. And so they do that to keep the rates high. And so amazingly, for no logical reason, and for reasons that don't really correspond to the situation of the market as far as goods, as far as the demand for goods are concerned, ocean freight rates, particularly from Asia to North America, have gone up and have continued to go up in spite of the fact that it's totally illogical. Normally, they should stay stable. They should have come down quite a bit and then maybe increased a bit when we started to come out of the lockdown, gradually. But So we have this odd situation with ocean cargo, is that currently rates have gone up for no real reason, or because of the reasons I explained. So for illogical reasons, from a pure merchant, from a customer's point of view, it's illogical, and we don't know if will continue like this, if the carriers will continue to have this discipline of limiting the sailings, or if they will start offering more sailings, and then which will give more competition, which will make the rates go down a little bit. Now, this is, of course, is affecting more the importers, because on the export side, I think there's usually less issues, and so export rates probably have remained more stable than import rates. So generally speaking, this is what is happening on the ocean freight side. Carriers work together in a way that it could be considered slightly uncompetitive or anti-competitive, sorry. And so another issue on air cargo that is has not been resolved, on ocean cargo that has not been resolved, is that crews are not, so far, are not considered essential workers. Unfortunately, they should be. They should have been from day one, but they are not. And so many countries, most countries in the world, will not allow a crew change in a port. And so it's quite a big problem for ocean transportation, is that you have crews that have been on board ships like this that are going across the globe on a continuous basis, carrying cargo, carrying our cargo, and the crews have been on the ship for 6 months or 8 months, and they're not able to disembark at a port and allow a change of crew. So that's a big issue, and which hopefully will be resolved, because it has not, so far, it has not impacted the supply chain, but who knows? Maybe it could. If it continues if it continues like this and it sort of gets worse, then what if these crews get sick and are no longer able to navigate these vessels? So something will have to be done. Something has to be done pretty soon. So no direct impact for us on the immediate front, but potential impact coming up, and for sure with serious problems. Now, I wanted to tell you, before we go into the other transportation modes, I told you earlier, I would tell you how our ports have been faring. So on the port side, I looked on the East Coast and got some figures from the ports of Halifax and the port of St. John. The one that's more representative is the port of Montreal, because there we got 6 months of cargo volume. And so you see, we also have a more complete picture. And it's a much bigger port. St. John is very small, and Halifax is also pretty small. So if we look at the Montreal figures, we see an overall reduction in volume of 9%, which sounds pretty reasonable. Like, you would have thought that maybe there would have been more reduction in volume. And what's interesting is that the container traffic is only down 1%. So business has continued to flow in ocean freight. Bulk is has gone down a lot more. So these are kind of interesting figures, I think. And also, if we compare to the West Coast, it's a slightly different scenario. On the West Coast side, Prince Rupert has had an increase, but it's more because of commodities, because of the demand. The new propane terminal and the demand for wood pellets has brought an overall increase. But if you look at the container business, their volume has been down 37% in May. And Vancouver has a similar picture. Business was down January to June, but not too badly, actually. And so Vancouver, of course, would be more sensitive to what's happening in Asia, whereas Montreal is more sensitive to what's happening in Europe because of their geographic specialization. So this is what I had prepared for you for ocean freight. So let us touch base a little bit on trucking. So generally speaking, on trucking, in Canada and in the States and many other countries, trucking, distribution, logistics, warehousing has been considered an essential activity. So really, the trucking industry has been moving, has been going, kept on going in spite of the pandemic. Of course, with difficulties because schedules are upside down and many customers were in lockdown, and there were rush and priorities to move different types of equipment, medicines, medical, personal protection equipment, food. So the whole the whole supply chain has been upside down. Generally speaking, trucking is working well in Canada, is working fine. And prices have come down simply because, so that these are overall figures, of course, average figures. Costs have come down simply because there's less demand and there's less volume, and there's as many trucks moving. So and I guess also fuel costs have gone down. The exception is for LTL cross-border. So LTL means less than trailer load. For those of you who are not familiar with this terminology, it means for small shipments, for pallets, pallet loads, as opposed to full loads. And cross-border refers to shipments moving to the US. So that segment has been costs on that have gone up. But of course, one of the reasons these costs have gone up is that it's getting harder and harder to find drivers who are willing to go to the US, to travel to the US. And we can guess why, right? We don't need to elaborate on that too much. The situation in the US is pretty grim as far as the pandemic is concerned, and the management of it and the number of people affected. And so trucking in Canada is functioning relatively well, I would say, and costs are, from a customer's point of view, costs are relatively stable, have come down. Shipping to the US is a bit problematic, and the other thing I wanted to point out as far as trucking is concerned is that we have been saying for a few years, we have been saying that there's a shortage of drivers. And I personally have been reading this in publications, in industry publications for the last 2 or 3 years. Almost every time, in every publication that comes out every month, I see something else, a new article about shortage of drivers. So we have a problem in Canada. There's a similar problem in the US. It's harder and harder to find truck drivers, and to incentivize people to work as truck drivers, simply because their working conditions aren't great, and the money we are willing to pay them is not enough, and there's so much competition. And so it is an issue. It is a general issue for trucking for the medium and long term in Canada, is a shortage of drivers, and that has been made worse by the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's hard to find drivers who are willing to drive to the US, and I perfectly understand them. On the rail front, I don't need to remind you that we had a rail blockade in early in the year, because we all remember that. But I mention it because it's a bit ironic, because this created a big issue for us in Canada, this rail blockade that lasted several months, and it was resolved just before the pandemic started. So I like to mention it for when I present to foreigners, to other countries, where I say that in Canada, in a way, we were prepared, almost prepared for the pandemic, because we had our own issues with logistics and transportation, because of this rail blockade. So just as the blockade was solved and we started to get reorganized, then the pandemic hit basically a few weeks later. So why is it important? Well, it's because most of a good proportion, a majority of our goods are moved by rail in Canada, whether they are the containers. Here I give you figures on container movements. Containers that arrive at Prince Rupert, they all move by rail. Containers that arrive at Halifax, 90% of them move by rail. In Montreal, it's a bit different because there's more road movements for Quebec and Ontario, but the biggest share of containers move by rail. So that was quite an issue for us back in January, February, beginning of March. Now, rail lines, of course, are affected by the pandemic. CP came up with good results, apparently, or less, not good results, but not as bad results as they were expecting. So what I picked up from this article and what I wanted to share with you was basically the fact that there's been good volumes of grain and bulk commodities and agri products, and that has sort of component reduction in forest products and particularly in automotive since the pandemic. All our automobile assembly plants have been closed. All our dealers have been closed for some time. So these are commodities that account for a good chunk of the business that railways carry in Canada. The overall picture for rail is that rail lines, our good old CP and CN had to cut costs in order to stay in business, laid off staff, unfortunately, and also were faced, in addition to the pandemic, they were faced with a reduction in energy products. But luckily, there was a good, strong trading in grain shipments, and so I guess that helped you the overall picture. Courier companies, let's touch on that because we see their trucks more and more on the roads, right, around us. So what's been happening to these people is they've been, as you can imagine, they've been extremely busy. Before the pandemic, they were extremely busy because of the increase in e-commerce trade. E-commerce business has been growing and growing, nonstop. And before the pandemic, and then when the pandemic hit, as we all know, everyone or most of us started to order things online, and so there's been a huge increase in e-commerce that has put a lot of pressure on these guys, and I think they're coping rather well, and they're expanding. I guess it's probably the only activity that's kind of growing steadily in the transportation world, in the logistics world, and it's to the extent where we're starting to see rate increases. And I picked up this article that talks about UPS increasing rates, but they all are, and they've been saying it. They've been saying that there's been such an increase in volume that they have to increase rates. And so unfortunately, it might be the smaller shipper that is hit more than the big shippers. The big shippers are able to negotiate rates, but the smaller shipper doesn't have enough volume for that. And so courier rates have been increasing and are likely going to increase because there's so much demand, and also because so much business has shifted from, these guys, these UPS, FedEx, DHL, most of their deliveries were B2B in the past, in the previous world we lived in. And today, most of the deliveries are B2C. Most of their deliveries are going to houses, to residences, to apartments, to townhouses and that, where sometimes people aren't home. So there's less density of then it's not the same delivering to private residences where maybe the people are not home as delivering to an industrial zone where you expect that there will always be somebody during business hours. So that business has been quite affected by the increase in e-commerce and the increase in B2C shipments. And so, of course, one of the things that one of my personal pet peeves, shall we say, is this idea of free shipping. So the growth of e-commerce wouldn't be so bad in itself, because we have to admit that it's convenient to shop online, but it wouldn't be so bad if it wasn't accompanied by this crazy idea of free shipping. So the free shipping that's been started, I think, by Amazon is sort of grown everywhere, and so everybody who sells online is expected to ship free. And of course, the impact on logistics is obvious. The impact on the environment also is obvious. That creates tremendous waste, because people don't hesitate to buy online, even if they think they're going to return the goods, because not only shipping is free, but also returns are free. So it's really, from an environmental point of view, as well as from a cost management point of view and common sense in logistics, it's really creating a lot of waste and additional cost, and indirectly puts the pressure on, we said a moment ago that it's hard to find drivers. It's hard to find truck drivers in Canada. There's a shortage of drivers. And so that's already a problem. So it's being augmented by the fact that we're looking for more and more drivers to deliver parcels that maybe people will return the next day, i.e. parcels that shouldn't be on the road in the first place. And so free shipping, I think, could be a topic on its own. And maybe today is not the place to discuss that, but I think it is a problem. And why is it a problem? Also is because it gives so much power to the tech companies. And so this is also something that's kind of odd that is coming out of this pandemic, is that e-commerce has been increasing like crazy. And also these so-called tech companies like Amazon and the Googles and the Facebook of this world are getting a bigger and bigger market share. And we're going to and a lot of businesses, a lot of independent businesses are going out of business, are going under in the meantime. So we're going towards a more monopolistic world where there's actually less players. There's more and more fields, areas where there's only a handful of big players, be it for phones or for advertising or for selling online. And so that is problematic in the long run, to have these huge companies have so much power. It's also problematic because they don't pay taxes, most of them. So our governments are busy helping ordinary citizens and helping businesses stay in business, stay afloat. And for that, they need revenues. And the companies that make the most money today are these tech companies, and they are the ones that don't contribute to society. So that is a problem. And some countries have recognized that, including Canada. That's why there's been, you might have heard about these discussions about the GAFA tax or the GAFAM tax, where different countries around the world, including Canada, want to find a solution in order to tax the profits that these companies make. But there's a big stumbling block in the US right now because the US don't want to hear of it, because incidentally, these companies are all US companies. So that is a problem. It's a bit of a wider problem than logistics. It goes way over that, but it is a problem. Now, when you talk about logistics, you want to know that your best allies in shipping goods, whether you're going to go by truck, by rail, by air, or by boat, is the international freight forwarders. And so I want to talk to you briefly about the Canadian International Freight Forwarders Association, which is an excellent source of information. If you're looking for freight forwarders, go on the CIFA website. You can select them. You can find them by province, by city. And you also have a lot of useful information, including related to the COVID pandemic. What's happening in that industry, in the freight forwarding industry, is there's been an industry consolidation. The bigger ones are getting bigger. The number 5 in the world, actually, DSV Panalpina, is a result of a merger between DSV, which was relatively small, and Panalpina. And so there's been a trend for industry consolidation, and it will probably continue. So there'll be fewer players, but they'll be bigger, and they'll control a bigger share of business. And so that's what I wanted to tell you about freight forwarders very briefly. Now let's talk a little bit about shipping goods across to the US. Now, I could not find a good picture of a Montana border crossing, so this one is in Ontario. So what's happening with on the US side, as you know, is that, as you can guess, is that trucks are the main mean of transportation that we use. It's about over half of what we ship to the US or what we sell to the US goes by truck. And then the second mode of transportation used is rail. And as you can imagine from the trade figures I shared with you a while ago, this reduction in trade has translated in reduction, of course, by the various modes of transportation. So I chose this to show you how the impact of the pandemic has been, how it has started slowly in March. You see in March, our truck movements between North American truck movements between Canada and the US were down 7%. Rail was also down 7%, but then in April, and that's the last stats that we have from the, these stats come from the US Department of Transportation. We don't have the May figures yet, but we see already the impact the pandemic had on trucks and rail movements. So aside from the fact that trade has been, that these means of transportation have been greatly affected, what we can say in general is that freight moves relatively smoothly. As we said a moment ago, trucks, rail, and all transportation modes are essential services. So they're able to go through the border without too many issues. The main problem now is health issues and finding drivers who are willing to take the risk of driving to the US and spend a few days there. So that is really the main issue. Now, on the 3PL front, and we're almost done, let me reassure you, I'm keeping an eye on the clock. On the 3PL front, the challenges that 3PLs have been facing really have to do with the shifts, the sudden shift in the supply chain. A lot of industries have been in lockdown, so a lot of companies haven't been moving stock anymore, the traditional supply chain, at least, with the exception, of course, of food and medical supplies and equipment. So that means huge challenges for 3PLs because stock is not moving the way it used to move. And then the items that are in demand are not the usual items. So everyone is that in the supply chain has to adjust, so including 3PLs. Now, a big challenge for 3PLs is really the growth of e-commerce, because it puts it puts pressure actually on industrial real estate. It puts pressure on facilities, because even though we have with the pandemic and the number of businesses that have gone under, particularly retailers, you'd think there's a lot of empty buildings available. But on the other hand, e-commerce requires a different type of building. You require a building that has a lot more space, because you don't stack things the way you do them in a traditional warehouse. You have to have a lot of space for fulfillment, for order picking. So the facilities that are used by e-commerce, which is of course experiencing a huge growth, are different facilities than the traditional warehouses that 3PLs have been operating. So they are challenging times. There's great opportunities for 3PLs, but they are basically exclusively tied to e-commerce and to the growth in e-commerce. Very briefly, when we ship perishables overseas, so when we ship them by ocean freight, we wanted to add just a little touch of that for information. Then we use ocean containers, we use reefer containers, refrigerated containers that maintain the cargo at the temperature that we want. We can heat cargo. We can keep cargo fresh, cool. We can also freeze cargo. So there's quite a wide range of temperatures. And this type of equipment is usually relatively easy to find, because there's been a huge demand, a huge increase. Globalization has brought a huge increase in the movement of foods worldwide, including fresh foods, frozen foods, and many perishables. And so all ocean lines have equipped themselves with refrigerated containers, and so they are usually pretty easy to find. One good practice, if you ship goods by ocean freight in a refrigerated container or in a freezer container, is to always have a temperature recorder. This is what we are showing here on the slide. That's to be able to prove that the temperature stayed steady during the transportation. You need that in case you have a claim on arrival. If you send goods by air, perishables by air, is slightly more challenging, because airlines don't usually maintain these types of containers. In ocean freight, ocean lines have these refrigerated containers. In air freight, you have to rent them. And so it's not terribly difficult or not terribly complicated, but it's a slightly different exercise. So there are these types of containers that will maintain temperature during the voyage. They usually have, you can either use dry ice. There are insulated containers. You either have dry ice compartments, or you have coolers that operate with batteries, with regular batteries, and that can maintain the temperature for 24, 48 hours, enough or even more, enough for a flight. So that's what you would use when you want to ship perishable goods by air freight. What scenarios are different scenarios for the evolution of world trade? Well, there's all kinds of different scenarios that all point to hopefully a recovery as soon as possible. It's also important to realize that trade in 2019 went down a little bit. So before the pandemic, there was already a small reduction in trade because of the trade wars that have been initiated by our neighbors down south. One of the results of the pandemic, of course, is that we realized that we depended too much on Asian countries, particularly China, for many supplies. And so a lot of companies are trying to reshore or planning to reshore their operations to go to shorter supply chains. Whether they'll be able to do that economically or not, we will see. So that's part of the challenges for companies who are doing worldwide business on a global scale. Now, the good news is, I want to give you good news, is that we have the new free trade agreement with our neighbors in the US and Mexico that was ratified in March and put into effect on July 1st. I don't like to advertise for this person, but we know that there are some questions, and we know also that there's a pretty big event happening in November. So we all keep fingers crossed that things will go in the right direction. What was tough when the NAFTA was being renegotiated was that the US president was threatening to cancel NAFTA altogether. And so luckily, we came to an agreement. We have a new trade agreement. It's in effect since July 1st, and it's great news that this is in place. Unfortunately, just as we celebrated the new agreement, we started to get these bad news about tariffs on Canadian aluminum. So we'll see how that goes. Canada had to announce retaliatory measures, so we will be taxing some US products. So this is a little bit of a cloud on the horizon, but we have to hope that things will fall into place soon. And I'd like to end the presentation with a smile and with a positive note, and to say that how fortunate we are in Canada to have these free trade agreements with these great trading blocks, NAFTA or CUSMA as we call it now, CETA with the European Union, the Trans-Pacific Partnership with Pacific countries that gives us great opportunities for us to expand our export business. And why is that important for us? Why is international trade important for us? Why I looked up figures, data from the World Bank. Do you know that exports contribute about 1/3 of our GDP, and so does imports? So that highlights the importance of international trade and of course exports. And this is how I wanted to end my presentation. I hope it's been interesting. I hope I didn't take too much time. I tried to speed up at the end so that we have ample time for questions. And so I'll be very happy to answer any questions you may have. And I thank you for your attention. So over to you, Evan.
Thank you so very much, Christian, for that very informative presentation. I encourage our listeners to reach out to you if they'd like any further information or have any more questions. But I guess to allow some additional time to think of any questions you may have right now, I'm just going to pull up my screen. first one is to talk about some kind of very timely virtual information sessions that we have coming up. The first two are actually going to be featuring Christian again. So I encourage you to, tell all your friends and register for all of these fantastic webinars. The sessions,
Absolutely.
Sessions can be found on Eventbrite, or reach out to me and I can send you the information as well. I'll also be running a trade and logistics workshop October 27th from 8 to 12, either in person in Calgary or virtually, depending on how things progress over the next few months here. Companies are invited to a half-day trade and logistics workshop focused on the agriculture sector, of course. Workshop will include industry experts who will provide companies with valuable information on logistics, cargo services, freight forwarding, and customs brokerage considerations related to exporting products, expertise and information on modes of transportation, including trucking and rail and air, information on market changes due to COVID-19 and market access opportunity updates, as well as connections to key organizations supporting SMEs growth in Alberta, including various regional economic development agencies. I also encourage you to subscribe to our monthly market news e-newsletter if you haven't already, to keep up to date on this workshop, as well as any other initiatives that my team is doing. So with that, I guess we'll open it up to questions. Again, please use the chat box to submit them. Looks like we have some rolling in right now. Get to here. So first question, will there be a recording? Yes, there will be a recording, and I will send that out to you guys following the presentation today. Looks like that was the only question. So unless anyone else, oh, one's rolling in. Okay, so here's a question for you, Christian. What significant changes are between the Incoterms 2010 versus the Incoterms 2020 that we should be keeping in mind? Oh, you're muted there, Christian.
Good point. Thank you, Evan. Yes, though there aren't huge changes really. There's some technical changes on insurance requirements, so the details, but details that are important. And the elimination of one of the Incoterms, DAT, was eliminated, and the International Chamber of Commerce introduced the Incoterm DPU, which is a new one, which gives the responsibilities of unloading the cargo at destination to the buyer, to the consignee, to the importer. So these are really the main changes. We have we have the same number of Incoterms. There's one DAT disappeared. It wasn't widely used. Replaced by DPU, which has unloading responsibilities on the buyer's side, which I think won't be extremely popular. I don't see it being very used, except perhaps for specific industries. And then technical changes when it comes to issuance of bills of ladings under FCA contracts, change in insurance requirements for CIP contracts, things like this. So no huge change. But what I found in this context is that even though there aren't huge changes in 2020, I gave several trainings on Incoterms starting in September 2019 when they actually came out. And what I found is that it was useful to take a step back and sort of review the topic, review the subject. And all companies that participated in trainings that I gave were all quite happy actually to have taken the steps of reviewing the whole topic. So even though there's no huge changes, I think it's still good to revisit the issue every 10 years or so, just to refresh our memory and be sure that we use the right ones, and that we are not that we don't lose out on something, or don't take unnecessary risk, or that we take advantage of the Incoterms as much as possible to be as competitive as possible. So I hope that answered your question. And if you have any personal experience, if you have an issue with, you know, if you heard something, or had an experience with any of the topics that I mentioned, also feel free to share perhaps your experience if you want. So I'm saying that assuming if you have no questions, for example, we could also have an exchange that way if you have an experience to share.
Doesn't sound like anyone has that experience they'd like to share, and it looks like there's no more questions.
I hope it doesn't mean that I spoke too much and that everyone fell asleep.
Or you just taught them everything they need to know.
There's always something more we need to know. That's the thing. Anyway, me included. Absolutely. We always want to learn something new every day. But yes, I hope that. So I hope that the points I covered were interesting and informative, and that it will help you also ask yourself the right questions, and guide you towards to make the right decisions as to, you know, which way you can go, or which way you should go in your exports endeavors. And as Evan said, we have a few more sessions coming up on exporting, so I really look forward to delivering those, and I hope you will share the information with friends, colleagues, and contacts and customers, and that we can speak again on that occasion.
Yes, thank you everyone once again for taking the time out of your day to join us. I really hope you found some value in attending, and yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. We'll take care, and goodbye for now.
Bye for now. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Evan and Megan.